Welcome to the Chaos Sector. We return to the Matrix. It's been a while, my friends. My colleagues have done a great job keeping the pressure on. Brian Koberger is facing a firing squad, that being a firing squad of conspirators hell-bent on framing him for a crime he never committed. We can confidently say that the majority of the public have come to the conclusion he is in fact being framed. And it's not helping the prosecution that they're throwing the surviving housemates under the bus. Well, as the saying goes, corruption is only loyal to corruption itself. Just flat-out nonsense. If a so-called witness provides her alleged accounts to not only law enforcement, but also has several interviews with completely different accounts, then everything from this so-called witness should be thrown out. She would be exposed on the stand for providing different accounts of that night. Therefore, it's not credible. For the defense to claim that detectives provided Dylan with her accounts is a very important claim, and it's supported by the fact that her accounts were different. If detectives provided a description of a male with bushy eyebrows, yet it was reported that Dylan had pictures of faces that also had bushy eyebrows, doesn't take a genius to put that together. The defense also claimed that detectives told her about the mask, and then this was used as a description of the alleged lone creeper in her affidavit. What this is presenting is a scenario that the suspect was basically generated from a picture on Dylan's wall. And the problem for the prosecution is due to the fact that Dylan has conflicting accounts of what happened. This opens up the possibility that detectives may have generated a suspect. That's a nice attack from the defense, because the prosecution is incapable of calling her to testify based on her unreliable testimony. And since her testimony is unreliable regarding being a witness, how can the prosecution simultaneously use her witness accounts and description of the suspect to match with the alleged Koberger? It's not credible. And for the prosecution to dump out the Amazon purchases from 11 months prior in another state only exposes that there wasn't a murder weapon, rather, accessories for camping. I guess the DNA is not as strong as it seems, right? Batfield claims that the prosecution has proof Koberger purchased the black mask months prior, the same type of mask described by Dylan. Oh, okay, that proves it. Let's break it down.
But let's start here. You cannot gauge a murder case by the sheer tonnage of the paper documents that it produces. But if you could, Idaho versus Koberger really would be the trial of the century. Yet another metric ton of motions have just been filed or responded to, each one giving us another sneak peek at the main event, which is now less than 5 months away, the trial of Brian Koberger. We've been digging through all these documents throughout the day, and among the revelations is evidence tying the defendant, Brian Koberger, to the black balaclava mask that was spotted by a surviving housemate. The prosecutors say they have proof that Brian Koberger bought a black balaclava mask, quote, the same type of mask described by Dylan Mortensen, from a Dick's Sporting Goods store in January of 2022. That's about 8 months before the murders. And speaking of Dylan Mortensen, the defense is now attacking her description of a mask-wearing intruder with bushy eyebrows.
Okay, wait, now this is important. As everyone knows, here at the Chaos, we don't take anything at face value. No proof the K-bar knife was used, only an assumption. A black mask being spotted doesn't mean Koberger was physically there. Don't get me started on the DNA. Let's continue, though.
The state says that is Koberger she's describing. The defense says, well, that witness, that roommate, that surviving roommate, was influenced by the detectives on the case. And they point to the fact that she admits she was drunk that night when she saw a stranger walking past her bedroom door. For what that's worth.
For what that's worth? Well, we can forget about the claim that she was drunk. It's a lie anyway. She got home at 1 a.m. By 4 a.m., when she allegedly saw Koberger, she had sobered up. How about the worth of Dylan's whereabouts not being provided by law enforcement? How Batfield? Surely you know this means the investigation was unlawful, right? Withholding information about a witness's whereabouts prior to a crime is protecting them from any criminal charge. And since this crime was murder, withholding Dylan's whereabouts proves she is a suspect. And if she is a suspect, her entire affidavit is thrown out the window. Now Batfield knows this, yet is standing before the viewers and have the nerve to be condescending about a murder trial. Let's continue.
In the earlier filings, prosecutors brought up this. Yeah, this is Koberger's purchase of a K-bar knife, which has never been found, and a knife sheath. That one matched the one found near 2 of the victims' bodies, and Koberger's DNA, the state says, is on that knife sheath. But the defense now claims that his Amazon purchase and his browsing history that showed he bought a K-bar knife and bought a knife sharpener and bought a sheath AK bar sheath. Well, the defense says that browsing history should be inadmissible because at the time he was living with his family, and other users could have been doing the typing, the searching, and the buying. They also say the knife and the sheath may have been part of a larger purchase with like camping supplies, including a tire inflator, a backpack, and bear spray. That is some good defense work right there. Because if you bought all those things, camping things, bear spray, tire inflator, backpack, and a K-bar knife in Pennsylvania, that would make sense. But if you can't produce that K-bar knife, or the sheath, or the sharpener, maybe not so much.
These alleged purchases can't be proven. Yet if Kohberger did in fact make those purchases, which was a part of a larger purchase for camping, then that actually is a strong defense. The reason it's a strong defense is because there is no concrete way to prove that the weapon used on the victims was a K-bar knife. And if the knife and the black mask was purchased for camping, then if those receipts can be provided by the defense, then it's going to be hard for the prosecution to deny the likelihood those items were purchased for camping. Now, what I didn't like was the defense stating that those items could have been purchased by someone else. What it does, essentially, is eliminates the defense of the purchases being made for camping, you see. Taylor should not give the prosecution any fuel to keep their fire burning, and with that statement, that's what happened. Now, if you notice, Batfield stated the purchase of the knife and the mask may have been a part of a larger purchase. The problem here is if there were other specific items mentioned, such as bear spray, tire inflator, and a backpack, is the defense assuming Kohberger made those purchases? Or does she have receipts that he made those purchases? That is extremely important because the specificity of those items indicate that there is at least a browsing of those items, which still provides a strong defense for Kohberger possessing the knife and mask. We assume it was in his browsing history, but was not included in the browsing history in the Amazon data dump. Of course, only focus on a mask and knife, not the other items that would have been purchased or were purchased, to eliminate the evidence Kohberger planned on going camping at some point. Again, for those items to be mentioned, there has to be evidence that they were paired with the knife and mask in a larger purchase for camping. Also, Batfield mentions that because the defense can't produce those items as evidence of the camping claim, then it's not a credible or logical defense. That sounds good, but why were those items introduced into the equation if they weren't at least a part of the browsing history? They have to be relevant because of the specificity. It would be different if it were just the knife and mask allegedly purchased. Then Kohberger would be in a bit of a jam, yet still no concrete proof he murdered anyone. But it would be very difficult for the defense to deny the possibility that those items were utilized that night, with Dylan describing a man in a black mask. But if those items were a part of his browsing history, which indicated he planned on going camping at some point, even though the descriptions still exist in the courtroom, it's being challenged by proof of another purpose, another plan, as opposed to being used to murder someone. Let's continue, though.
Don't forget, he was also known to search, apparently according to the state, for a replacement knife and sheath.
Okay, now this is suggestive programming. Batfield is suggesting that Kohberger committed the murders, tossed the knife and mask, and then went back on Amazon to purchase them again. I guess he was planning on striking again, yeah. But if the prosecution has so-called evidence he was searching for those items, don't they also have evidence there were searches for bear spray, tire inflators, knife sharpeners, and a backpack? The defense claimed those searches were made, right? Camping is the purpose for the purchase and search of those items on Amazon, based on the defense's stance. And when you factor in that this activity was done 11 months prior to the murders, in Kohberger's home state of Pennsylvania, how can the prosecution convince the jury that those items were not purchased for camping? Now, what Batfield is doing, which the prosecution is also suggesting, is that there is no evidence of those other camping items being purchased or searched, and it doesn't matter if they were, because the two items purchased were allegedly used by Kohberger on that night. But again, you have to acknowledge that the purchase was made 11 months prior in another state. And there hasn't been a motive established on top of that. Yet, as we all know, the anchor that pulls Kohberger down into the deep waters is the alleged DNA discovered on a knife sheath. But let's continue.
I could go on, believe me, but I'm going to stop here and bring in the best resource I can think of in this story, and that is our own Brian Enton. Okay, Brian, let's start with the balaclava. Again, I couldn't believe it. Today, documents showing that they have the receipts, the state has the receipts for the black balaclava from Dick's Sporting Goods. However, if I'm the defense, I'll say this is Idaho. It is freezing in Idaho, and lots of people wear these balaclavas. Oh, and P.S., he bought it in January, in winter in Pennsylvania. I guess that makes sense, but it's really going to have to be add this to the mountain of evidence and see how the jury feels about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point that the defense likely will make. There was another just mountain of documents that were released late today that you mentioned that we're still going through. Reading the footnotes, a lot of these new nuggets, these bombshell nuggets, are sort of buried in the documents, including this latest about the balaclava, which, by the way, just to be honest, I didn't even know what a balaclava was. At first I was thinking baklava, like the Greek food, but no, it is a mask. You see it on your screen. That's what it looks like. It's similar to like something that we would wear skiing or that you'd wear on a very, very cold day. And the state got all of the records, got all of the shopping records, has the receipt from Dick's Sporting Goods, and says that Bryan Kohberger bought that on January 10th, 2022, 11 months before the murders. You mentioned it. He was still living in Pennsylvania, and that they plan to bring this in during the trial, Ashley.
So, obviously question number one would be, that's fine if you bought the balaclava in Pennsylvania, or if your family bought the balaclava in Pennsylvania, show it. Where is it? If they have a black balaclava in the, things that they seized from his apartment in Washington, that would be one thing, but I never saw one on the manifest, did you?
Okay, Batfield, carrying water for the prosecution, demands that the defense provide evidence those items are still in the possession of the family. It's a fair question, but it would suggest that a mask that was purchased 11 months prior, which had a different purpose at the time of that purchase, was then used to murder those housemates, once Kohberger settled in Pullman 11 months later. And if we factor in the time frame he would have to track those housemates, it would be a few months after he enrolled at WSU. You see, the DNA is what keeps everything attached to him. Without it, there is absolutely no evidence to go by. A 28-year-old who had turned his life around, striving to obtain his personal goals, just decided to throw it all away, with observing those housemates somewhere, becoming obsessed with them, although there's no evidence, tracked them down to their home address, and then on a Saturday night, which is a party night, decided to enter a neighborhood where there were multiple vehicles parked in the driveway, and had the balls to enter and attempt to murder someone or a group without being spotted. Wouldn't he factor in screaming? Wouldn't he factor in a strong resistance? Wouldn't he factor in that his vehicle, being a light bulb, would be spotted by everyone leaving the neighborhood after everyone heard the violence in the home? If he attempted to get away with the crime, that was definitely not the strategy. Not so intelligent from a pretty intelligent guy, right? Some would rebuttal and say it was his obsession that overwhelmed him, and he didn't think the plan all the way through. Yeah, nice try, but no. For one, the first element of the plan would be to not drive a highly visible vehicle into a neighborhood at night. Second, whoever the target was, surely he didn't want to engage with multiple housemates. But apparently he took that risk. I could go on listing the reasons why a lone killer doesn't make sense. But let's continue.
No, I do not remember seeing it on the manifest. Granted, a lot of new things continue to come out. It's possible that we just don't have that document because we didn't even know that the balaclava existed or was part of this until today with this latest document dump. I also think this is going to be really interesting, and I'm curious whether this comes up. Since he was living with his family, there's been talk of a shared Amazon account. So how are they going to prove who actually bought the mask? Because you mentioned, if you live in a cold climate, could have been anyone in the family.
Sure, and I'm sure that anyone in the family wants to help his defense more than likely, so just produce the balaclava. And oftentimes, Brian, detectives can do amazing things by matching certain fabrics with certain lots from that particular purchase. So they've got that purchase, they've got the information on it, maybe they could go deep and find out if they do provide a balaclava, if it is the actual one that was purchased. I've seen that happen in trials before. And by the way, those are weird things to have. I never had one in my house until I married somebody who gets cold skiing and skis with one of those. But they are not every household has one of those, so they're unusual purchases. Speaking of that, go into that a little deeper, Brian, that the fact that the defense will say, Bryan Kohberger was living at home in Pennsylvania, and they were sharing, Amazon purchases throughout the family, so you don't know who was doing the typing or doing the purchasing. And that would extend to the knife sheath, to the knife sharpener, right? And any other purchases that they find unusual.
And this may be one of the reasons we may see Bryan Kohberger's family members, his parents and sister, called as witnesses during the trial. This has been brought up in some of the documents. This may be the reason why. You know, there's been discussions in these documents that I've been going through about, well, if they get called as witnesses, they're not allowed to be in the courtroom before that. They may not be allowed to be in court during the trial because they're going to be witnesses. Why would they be witnesses? This could very well be the reason. The state may want to nail down, call them up under oath. Are you the one who ordered the knife? Are you the one who ordered the mask? And if they say no, process of elimination, they'll, explain to the jury that it was actually Brian Kohberger.
It's irrelevant, just a slick pivot. It wouldn't matter who purchased it from the prosecution's view because they are using those very purchases, that being a K-bar knife and a mask, that were used to murder the housemates. It's irrelevant in context. To elaborate, let's say the family did purchase them. The prosecution would still charge Kohberger with the crime. If the family didn't purchase those items, same outcome. What's happening here is deflection because they are pivoting away from the fact that those purchases were made 11 months prior in another state. And since there hasn't been any link between Kohberger and the victims, this becomes more and more significant. It supports the claim that those items were in fact purchased for camping. The prosecution would then suggest that Kohberger then used those items, which were for camping, and decided to use them in his plan to murder those housemates. That's a very dubious position the prosecution would be in, trying to explain this scenario in court. If those purchases were made in Pullman during his time attending WSU, then it may be a bit more suspicious, even from our viewpoint. Yet they were made 11 months prior to the murders, no knowledge of those housemates, as there hasn't been any connection at any point throughout the investigation, and it was in another state, 2,400 miles away from Moscow, Idaho. Logic is on the defense's side, yet they're fighting against the so-called evidence, being DNA. The thing about this setting is the jury has time to think, and thinking brings about logic. Let's continue.
And also, I'll go one further, Mr. Kohberger, where's the knife? Mrs. Kohberger, where's the knife and the sheath? Sister of Brian Kohberger, where is the knife sharpener if any of you lived in the same house and were purchasing off the same computer? I think we're well past those days, though, for many people, where you're sharing a household computer. Most of us have our own accounts and our own computers, but I will give the defense that it's just produce the things that suddenly don't exist, that if a family member bought, I'm sure they would still have, 11 months later.
Okay, if Kohberger purchased this mask 11 months prior to the murders in another state, then the purchase, along with the K-bar knife, and with the intentions on purchasing a backpack, tire inflator, bear spray, and even a knife sharpener, at this very moment, these items are purchased for camping. This is 11 months prior to even being in Pullman, and we still have to point out that there has not been any evidence of a motive, nor link to the victims. With the scenario, the state wants the jury to believe that without any proof of a motive, nor proof of a connection or knowledge of those housemates, Kohberger moved from Pennsylvania to Pullman for school, became a student and teacher assistant, at some point spotted those housemates, and without any motive nor proof of stalking, within a few months of his attendance at WSU, followed them home previously, I guess 12 times previously to be exact, then used the same items he purchased 11 months prior in Pennsylvania on those college students, with no evidence he knew any of them, nor anyone associated with them. They're actually making it less believable, you see? Just stick with the DNA, that's your strongest attack. But they have to try to convince the jury and the public that Kohberger was guilty by presenting information that they think aligns with what unfolded that night. It's working against them, because if Kohberger made those purchases a year prior in another state, isn't it safe to say that he had other plans for the items he purchased? Oh, yeah, well, he did have other plans initially, but once he got to Pullman, he ran across some beautiful young girls, and it went downhill from there. Yet, there is no evidence he even knew them, so where is the missing link in the chain of events? It doesn't exist. Let's continue.
Another question for you, and that is that the defense wants some of the, I think the entire eyewitness testimony thrown out, right, from Dylan Mortensen. There's a couple of things. They say that the witness was drunk. They say it was dark. I've seen lots of cases that happen in the dark. And that millions of people have bushy eyebrows, and that her characterization of a witness with bushy eyebrows shouldn't count. This was interesting, though, and I didn't know about this, and maybe you could explain it. They say that the detectives influenced Dylan's memories about the eyebrows and the balaclava. What's that about?
Yeah, and that's what they're saying. And let me just tell you that, because I read all of the filings, many of this back and forth is because the defense wants basically everything thrown out.
Yeah, everything should be thrown out because the defendant was framed for the crime. But the reason, of course, is Dylan's accounts are so inconsistent. It went from her accounts not being reliable to actually Dylan withholding information, and that only leads to questioning if the defendant was the killer. And if she is withholding information, then obviously detectives are a part of this conspiracy. Remember, Dylan's accounts have changed numerous times throughout this case. Her affidavit claims to have awakened at 4 a.m., hearing Murphy barking and such, to yelling at her housemates about trying to go to sleep. These are different scenarios with different potential outcomes. Then it was revealed her and Bethany were texting each other, which was never mentioned in the affidavit. Then she claimed she couldn't recall much because her memory was fuzzy, almost like a dream. Yes, so intoxicated, incapable of remembering details, yet explained a lot in detail in her affidavit. Regarding a lone killer, though, yeah. She claimed that Kaylee ran downstairs at one point. None of that was mentioned in her affidavit. If she claimed to have awakened at 4 a.m. in her affidavit, yet the text messages prove she was awake prior to that, then she was never asleep. Now, if her accounts have many scenarios, the jury would glare in confusion, or even suspicion, of Dylan testifying in court. It opens up a can of maggots, because Dylan was coached to say certain things, based on what truly happened. The defendant is in custody for the crime, so there was no turning back on covering up the truth. So yeah, the defense should request Dylan's witness accounts be thrown out. She's all over the place. If Dylan takes the stand, she would crack with the first question from the defense.
It feels like, and they are trying everything they can and seeing what sticks. So I wouldn't read into it too much that they're trying to get Dylan's testimony thrown out, but they are saying, and she did several interviews, so it's a little confusing. It's not like she just talked to police one time, but the defense is claiming that it was police who introduced the bushy eyebrows first, and that then she went along with that. We don't know whether that's really true. And in terms of this mask, this balaclava, I don't even know if I'm saying it right. That's how I think you say it. They are claiming that they also told her about the mask first, and then she went along with the mask, so that basically she may have been coaxed into saying those things. We haven't been able to listen to the interviews. Again, there were multiple. We haven't been able to see the full transcripts, so we don't really know whether or not that's totally true.
You are saying balaclava, right? You are definitely showing the fact that you're from
good.
Florida. The rest of us live with those things from Canada. But it was interesting. We just had up on the screen what looked like a piece of paper with a drawing on it, a very rudimentary drawing. I'm going to ask our control room to put that back up on the screen. This is apparently Dylan's drawing of the mask that she said she saw him wearing. And as rudimentary as it is, it sure looks a heck of a lot like the balaclava that we were showing earlier as well. It looks exactly like that. So I don't know if the detectives coached her to draw that, but if she drew that before they mentioned balaclava, I think the defense has a tough row to hoe there, because that looks a lot like it. You know, even in your terrified state, if you're drawing that, that looks a lot like it. So the other thing...
Is Koberger the only one who owned a balaclava mask? Oh, never thought about that. Now did you, Batfield? What if one of the additional males that were in the home wore that mask? In fact, those masks were quite popular among that college circle. Even Dylan had a pink one, remember? Surely others within that college circle had them. You know, Batfield claimed that they're not that popular, and many people don't own them. And they're weird and all, but criminals have them. What she tried to do is isolate Koberger as being someone who had it for that specific reason, that being a serial killer. Yet Dylan herself had one. She simply described one of the males who in fact had one on. But of course the authorities wouldn't bring them in for questioning, so they simply generated another person. Used that specific male, created a lone killer, with the physical description of bushy eyebrows, from one of the pictures on her wall, and bingo, a lone killer with a black mask and bushy eyebrows was plucked out of thin air.
I was so fascinated when the defense brought up all these developmental disorders they say Brian Koberger has. OCD, autism, and then this other one, developmental coordination disorder. That's a DCD, developmental coordination disorder. And the defense made great hay about saying, you know, Brian's got this. He can't possibly have the coordination or speed to be able to pull off the kind of murder that happened in that house. I mean, it was all of about 20 minutes or so. And they did the test. The police did the test. They parked, they ran from the car, they went through the house, they mimicked what the murders must have been like, and then they ran from the house and, you know, pretended to get rid of all the bloody clothes and get back in the car, all in the prescribed time frame. And the defense said his condition makes it impossible for him to be able to do that. And then came the state's response to that. Take it away, Brian.
Now, I don't agree with the defense using this as evidence Koberger couldn't have committed the murders, because, well, they should just stick to the counter evidence. You know, such as there being no link between Koberger and the victims. Cell phone data showed his location traveling southwest of Moscow. No physical proof that Koberger was in Moscow during the time frame the murders occurred. The 3 additional males whose DNA was discovered at the crime scene, including blood on the stair rail and a glove. Stay focused on the key factors, because if you continue to wander off into these areas, it does not eliminate the criminal act, only gives it, quote, conditions. And since Koberger would be considered mentally ill anyway, based on the crime he allegedly committed, this does not help that image. Don't provide the prosecution any real estate to rebuttal such claims. It sounds like an effective argument based on the alleged poor coordination Koberger has, but the defense is entering the realm of possibility that Koberger was physically there. If it came down to poor coordination, in relation to the time that it took to commit the crime, that is a horrible defense to even throw out there. Because despite poor coordination, the act of committing the murder itself is still held up in court based on what? Take a wild guess, that's right, the DNA discovered in the home. And also, since the time of death hasn't been officially confirmed, it does not eliminate the possibility that Koberger could have committed the crime. It just would be an extended amount of time he took to do so. We've said this prior, the defense should stop playing mind games with the prosecution, because they are trying to sentence your client to the death penalty. You need to be a bit more fierce in the courtroom. Let's wrap it up.
Yeah, and let me just read you this response because I think it's worth just reading word for word. I jotted it down here. This is what the state is saying that the expert that the Koberger team said in relation to all this. To the extent defendant currently has any motor impairment, even according to his own expert, it affects only his fine motor dexterity and vulnerabilities in visual motion functions. The examples she uses for fine motor dexterity include when he had poor handwriting and trouble tying his shoes in the past. So the state is saying, wait a minute. All of a sudden, you have brought in all of this evidence that he's on the autism spectrum, that he's got OCD, that he's got developmental coordination disorder, something we hadn't heard anything about until recently. What does that really have to do with anything? And they're saying even your own expert is saying that is saying that it wouldn't have impacted whether or not he would have been capable of these murders.
Yeah, that sounded like the air going out of a balloon, for the defense pretty darn quickly. Fine motor skills, picking up something tiny and putting it into a little bottle. Gross motor skills, jamming a knife into 4 people very quickly and running from room to room. And there didn't seem to be any problems with his gross motor skills.
You see, this is not how you attack the prosecution. No need to mention anything about Koberger being on the autism spectrum, because mentioning it is suggesting it was physically impossible for him to carry out those murders due to his condition. Yet, you're presenting this in the face of his DNA being discovered on a knife sheath in one of the victim's bedrooms. What merit would it have against that evidence? It would have absolutely no bearing on how the jury would view Koberger. Autism wouldn't erase the actual crime he committed. We know it's been close to 3 years now, and the defense has tried literally everything. But you have to stick to your guns, because the prosecution's plan is to create such circumstances. We can also include these judges as well. We all know the trial will determine Koberger's fate, but it doesn't mean the defense should bring about claims that do not effectively defend Koberger. All that will happen is the mainstream media will keep pushing the narrative he is guilty. As Batfield stated, based on that coordination claim, it appears the air has gone out of their balloon. Mentioning balloons, it could be seen as a chess move using, quote, hot air before the big guns come out in trial. Yet, you have to keep in mind, the judge and jury can be manipulated by emotion and fear of speaking from the heart. So you don't want to give them any doubts leading up to the trial. Just our thoughts at least. For example, the prosecution provides evidence Koberger purchased the knife and mask. The defense counters claiming those items were a part of a larger purchase for camping. That's enough, stay right in that pocket. Keep reiterating that the purchases were for camping, 11 months prior to the murders in another state. No need to mention a hypothetical scenario where Koberger couldn't have physically committed the murders due to some coordination issues. In that hypothetical scenario, Koberger is pulled back into the home potentially, from the judge and jury's view, because it's a weak argument.
We can all say that it's courtroom filler. Before the trial, we get that. Yet it wasn't something the prosecution claimed, and the defense rebutted it. Meaning, the defense introduced this as supporting evidence that Koberger didn't commit those murders. Despite this unfolding in hearings, it does not help Koberger whatsoever. It does not challenge the alleged DNA discovered at the crime scene, which places him physically in the home. So it's literally pointless to mention it. Now, if you were to mention Koberger's condition in relation to his activities, such as stargazing, which based on his cell phone data and geolocation placing him at the park that night, then the mention of autism would actually be beneficial. I mean, if you're going to mention it, at least associate it with the claim he was stargazing that night. But to throw it out there almost in a random way, it does appear desperate. In conclusion, the key to this information and evidence is that the purchase was made 11 months prior, in another state, while residing in that state. It has been proven that Koberger was fond of the outdoors, and if the defense can build on that, then this is supporting evidence. Yet, as we all know, it will come down to the DNA discovered at the crime scene. That is the anchor that's pulling Koberger down. Butt and Taylor has bolt cutters, and the prosecution knows it. This is the—
Wait, before we leave you, let's preview what's next. A question. So, you saw someone on the floor? Did you ever think to check on them? Oh, you didn't think to check? That was never in the affidavit. Would have changed the entire investigation. This is the chaos sector.